Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to get started here. So, since 2012, 9 states, including California, have made marijuana legal for adults who are 21 or older. Karen O'Keefe will examine how states are legalizing, taxing, and regulating the multi-billion-dollar cannabis market and how legalization and regulation promotes customer, worker, and environmental safety. However, the challenges surrounding cannabis policy do not end at legalization. Ms. O'Keefe will also discuss challenges that remain, including local bans, federal marijuana prohibition, and continued demand for legally grown marijuana from states that still prohibit it. As the Director of State Policies and Lobbying Efforts at the Marijuana Policy Project, Karen O'Keefe manages grassroots and direct lobbying efforts in state legislatures for the largest nonprofit that is focused solely on marijuana policy reform. In her 15-year career at MPP, Ms. O'Keefe and her team have played a leading role in more than a dozen successful advocacy campaigns, including the first legalization law to pass a state legislature. Ms. O'Keefe earned her JD from Loyola School of Law, New Orleans. Ms. O'Keefe's talk is the second in a series hosted by the Rose Institute of State and Local Governments on the topic of public policy implications of marijuana legalization. Please join me in welcoming Ms. O'Keefe.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here at your lovely campus. I'm Karen O'Keefe, as you said, and I'm going to talk about marijuana legalization. First of all, I wanted to start out with why we should legalize and regulate marijuana. Of course, marijuana is already legal here in California, but it isn't at the federal level nor in 41 states. When I first started working on this issue, I'd done a lot of stuff on death penalty and human rights, and a lot of friends just didn't quite get why this was something that I was interested in from a social justice perspective, but most of them do now. So the biggest reason for me is really the human impact on marijuana prohibition, how many people's lives it has derailed, destroyed, and in some cases ended. Every single year, there are about 500,000 or more people arrested or in some cases cited for marijuana. In some cases, those people end up in jail. In some cases, they don't. There actually aren't federal statistics on how many people are in jail at any given time for marijuana. There's some rough data on how many are in state and federal prison, but the number of people that just can't make bail and are held for a couple nights and maybe lose their job or have disrupted life with their family at home, we don't have those numbers. Even if a person is just given a citation, ends up in court, and gets convicted without spending any jail time, a criminal conviction can derail a person's entire dreams. I had a couple of friends in college who had planned on having careers, in one case in teaching and one in law school, but had marijuana convictions on their record and thought they would not be able to get the professional licensing that they needed, and so they ended up going into different professions as a result. You've probably seen when you apply for jobs, questions in a lot of states are included about if you've been convicted of a crime, a person can be denied jobs, education, many different kinds of professional licensing just for having been convicted for marijuana. In addition to that, in some cases, people have died as a direct result of marijuana prohibition. Of course, there's still no data. No one's collecting a list of how many people have died as a result, but here are just a few. In Michigan, about a decade ago, there was a transgender woman who got busted for a small amount of marijuana. Police told her that if she did not narc out the person that sold her the marijuana, she'd go to jail. And being transgender, she would be put in with men, and she could be a victim of sexual assault or even murder. So she decided to inform on her dealer, and the police apparently told the dealer that she'd done so. And she ended up murdered, and her body was burned. In DC, when I lived there, there was a man named Jonathan Magby who was a quadriplegic, and he used cannabis to relieve his symptoms. It was before the district had medical marijuana. And the judge, when he got arrested for possessing marijuana, he said that it made him feel better. And so he wasn't sorry enough that he had used marijuana. He went to jail, he wasn't given his ventilator, and he ended up dying a few days into his sentence. There are also a lot of people that have been robbed who are selling marijuana illegally, or they get in fights with other people. When you're the victim of an armed robbery for selling something illegal, you're not going to call the police, of course, because you'll end up arrested yourself. And so these are two of the many people that ended up dead because they were robbed in the course of a marijuana robbery. In one case, the man had been robbed before. He set up a security camera, but of course he didn't call the police and didn't really have any recourse. So this is another piece of the human cost of marijuana prohibition. We saw the same thing with alcohol prohibition. It bred Al Capone, there were shootouts on the street. We don't see that happening between Coors Beer and other brewers these days. Next up, legalization is really important for racial justice. When we look at all of those impacts, all of the criminalization, data shows time and again that it falls disproportionately on people of color. African Americans are 3.7 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana, despite similar marijuana use rates. There was a wonderful book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander that talks about drug convictions in general. And at every stage of the process, from arrest to prosecution to sentence, people are treated worse if they're people of color in the criminal justice system. So all of these impacts that destroy people's lives are worse and racially unequal. And we've also seen that marijuana prohibition itself was born of racism. It actually started in a number of states, including California, and was fueled by racism against Mexican immigrants. The word marijuana comes from the Spanish word for marijuana, before it was called cannabis here. And the man who led the federal charge to criminalize marijuana federally, Harry Anslinger, if you look up his quotes, he's just said horribly racist things as the reason to criminalize marijuana. So the history and now the current enforcement of it has been very racist. Next up, the only way you can really control marijuana is if it's legal and regulated. When something's illegal, you have no control over it. You don't know what people are buying, you don't know what they're selling, you can't control where it's sold, but when it's legal and regulated, you can. You can also have lab testing. So when I grew up outside Detroit, and since then I've talked to a number of people that bought marijuana in the streets or got it from friends where it was laced with drugs they never would have used voluntarily. There was one woman who was dating somebody that I knew, or I knew her, and he admitted that he had laced it with PCP, which is a very dangerous drug. And that's just the potential lacing, which might be rare, but again, we don't have data when it's something illegal. People aren't gonna go call the cops and say, I bought marijuana and it was laced with something. You also can test for pesticides, molds, contaminants, and all kinds of other things that can make people sick. When marijuana is legal and regulated, you can have standardized dosing so people know how potent it's going to be, and other important consumer safety measures. You can also have education, because there are some people for whom marijuana can be problematic, and you can have warnings that have to be included that can say if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, there could be risks. If you have a family history of certain psychiatric issues, there could be risks. If you have a problem with marijuana, here's how you can get help. You don't have that kind of access to consumers if something's illegal and in the shadows. You also have protection for workers. When marijuana is illegal, of course, workers have no protection at all. They don't have minimum wage. They can be charged with a felony. They can be exploited. There was an expose, investigative report by a group called Reveal about the kind of gray market marijuana cultivation in Northern California a few years ago. And there were a lot of women who had been sexually assaulted who were working kind of in the shadows. And of course, again, you're not going to go to the police if what you're doing is illegal in a lot of cases. And so it leaves people very vulnerable to having wage theft and other kinds of exploitation, and of course to felony charges. We also have the issue of environmental protections. When marijuana is illegal, here in California, we've seen it grown in very environmentally sensitive areas, and this is also was the case before medical marijuana was well regulated. You have people diverting streams, you have diesel pollution, you have people using things to kill rats that would gnaw into the irrigation that end up getting in the food chain and endangering animals like the fishers, which are an endangered animal. There's a lot of environmental destruction if you have something pushed into the shadows, and who's going to care about complying with the water law or environmental law if everything they're doing is legal. You can also have child-proof packaging when marijuana is legal and regulated. Legalization also generates revenue instead of wasting it. The states, even mid-sized states that have made marijuana legal, once you have a mature market, they generate hundreds of millions of dollars every year that can be used for healthcare, education, and other things. And it also frees up law enforcement resources to focus on serious crimes. When law enforcement aren't arresting hundreds of thousands of people for marijuana, they can spend their time preventing and enforcing other crimes. Nationwide, only 46% of violent crimes and 18% of property crimes result in arrests. And we also have a problem with 13,000 untested rape kits in California alone. When you have labs spending their time testing marijuana for court cases, they're not doing other things that are much better uses of their time. Next up, cannabis is safer than alcohol. Just from a personal liberty perspective, in this country, we value freedom. We think generally people should be allowed to do what they want. There might be a line that we draw, but if we've drawn the line and said that people can use alcohol, they can eat sugar, they cannot exercise, then why should they be prohibited and criminalized for using something that's so much safer than alcohol? Marijuana isn't linked to violent crimes. If you use 10 times the amount of alcohol that you use to just get a little buzz, you die. With marijuana, nobody's ever been shown to die from an overdose. It's also not linked to increased mortality. Alcohol causes cirrhosis of the liver, cancer. We have about 30,000 people that die every year from those kind of health effects from alcohol. Marijuana has never been shown to cause a death from an overdose, and it's not linked with those kind of things. So stepping back, I wanted to talk briefly about where we are with marijuana policy reform. As was mentioned, there are 9 states where marijuana is legal. In a couple of them, they're still getting the regulations in place and sales haven't begun. One of the states, Vermont, doesn't allow sales, nor does DC. They just allow possession and cultivation. And then Canada, just on October 17th, they started legal sales. And we have one other country, Uruguay, in South America, that has legalized and regulated marijuana. And then in the Netherlands, since the 70s, they've had this kind of weird situation where they openly tolerate stores and they won't prosecute them, but they're technically illegal. And the cannabis sold there is all illegal as well. So most of this has happened, all of these states legalized since 2012. So it's been a very rapid evolution. And what does it look like? In the states where marijuana is legal, instead of having marijuana grown in parks or other environmentally sensitive locations, it's in regulated stores or businesses like this one in Colorado with security, pesticide control, and other rules. The marijuana is tested in labs like this one in Las Vegas. And it's sold in licensed cannabis retailers like this one in Las Vegas and ones here in California. Some common features of the laws are that they, as I mentioned, license all of the areas, all of the different types of businesses. Typically, we have standalone cannabis stores. You don't see marijuana being sold at grocery stores or 7-Elevens yet. Part of the reason might be federal law. It's also kind of a slow evolution. We'll see if eventually that might change. In New York, the liquor and wine sellers would like to be allowed to sell marijuana too. Of course, most of the marijuana stores only let people 21 and older in, and that's not the case for alcohol. So we'll see if that changes eventually in some places. You also always have consumer protection. They require lab testing for pesticides that can be dangerous and other contaminants. There's labels to say how much THC and other types of components of marijuana are in the cannabis. You often have warnings about overconsumption. Initially in Colorado, there were a lot of novice users and not a lot of knowledge about the fact that if somebody uses an edible, it can take a long time to take effect. So people didn't get an effect right away and ate more and more and got way, way too intoxicated. So now there's more of a public education campaign to start low and go slow to educate people against that happening. All the laws have pretty strict regulations to protect minors, to make sure you have child-proof packaging, which does have some environmental issues as well. There's restrictions on advertising so that it can't be in markets that are not vast majority adults. There's also prohibitions in most states on packaging that's likely to appeal to minors. So you can't have like gummy bears that are actual bears, and the states vary in how strict they are, but they all have some kind of provision like that. We also have excise taxes. Marijuana is not just subject to standard sales tax. It has a sin tax, so to speak. Usually medical marijuana is either exempt or has a lower tax rate. Most of the laws have data collection, so they can see kind of how it's going and tweak things if there's a need to do so. In a lot of the states, they train drug recognition experts, which are law enforcement that recognize symptoms of impaired driving. Unlike alcohol, there's no magic number or breathalyzer that can tell you somebody's pretty certain to be impaired. Instead, THC stays in the system for a very long time, and so a person would test positive when they hadn't used marijuana in days. So instead, law enforcement are trained to look at the signs, look at all the evidence, which can include those tests, but not solely the test, and that's true for all kinds of prescription drugs too. And of course, there's usually public education. This I took in Seattle. It says, talk with your kids. Marijuana can increase the risks of school failure and depression. When I went there, I didn't see a single marijuana ad, but I saw a few of these ads to urge people to talk to their kids about marijuana. So next up, what challenges remain? Well, of course, marijuana is still illegal at the federal level. And so technically, people could be prosecuted at any, who are selling marijuana, who are purchasing marijuana. That hasn't happened, but there's no federal law or even policy preventing it right now. There are also 41 states with marijuana prohibition there still. And so that means there's still a ton of demand for marijuana. And a lot of the so-called problems you hear with states where marijuana is legal and regulated are actually caused by the lack of complete legalization, because there's still demand. So you hear, for example, of marijuana being exported from Colorado to these other states. And so until we have legalization everywhere, somebody is going to meet that demand, whether it's cartels or whether it's in legal states or in the national parks. So we're not going to have the harms of prohibition gone when there's still prohibition. You also have a lot of localities, most of the laws allow local bans. So you're still going to have all of the factors related to prohibition as long as there is some prohibition. Another thing some states have been trying to address better is how to foster equity. Marijuana prohibition was born of racism. It's still unequally enforced. It's so important that the opportunities in the legal market be available for the people that have been the most impacted by the war on marijuana. A lot of states are trying to take some robust steps to address that, including Massachusetts and a lot of cities in California. I think we're still learning what works best. Some of them have training programs for people from communities that have been hard hit by the drug war. Some of them kind of give a leg up in the application process. In some cases, there aren't as many applicants as we'd like, so they might have too high of hurdles for all the applicants, but that's something that we continue to look at and that states are trying to do better on. Also, erasing past convictions so that people aren't continually haunted by convictions for things that are illegal is something that states are starting to do more. Another thing is a lot of states don't have any on-site consumption, the equivalent of bars. So you do hear of some people smoking in the streets. There's nowhere to consume marijuana legally other than a home. And some people might have landlords who don't allow marijuana consumption. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And then there's also the issue of just the stigma that some people still have about marijuana, and specifically employment testing. No state has prohibited employers from firing somebody for testing positive for marijuana, and a person can test positive weeks after. So you still have some kind of consequences that people are haunted with. Maine actually temporarily banned firing employees for marijuana, and then the legislature revoked it. So eventually that might change, but for now, that's another challenge. So the first two states, Colorado and Washington, passed their law just about exactly 6 years ago. Colorado was the first state that had legal and regulated sales. Washington followed about 6 months later. California's law is pretty new and is still kind of in a transition period. They don't even have permanent rules yet. So I'm going to look at how things are going specifically in Colorado, since it's the oldest, and conveniently, the state public safety department just released a comprehensive 266-page report. So, most important to me, I think, is fewer lives are being ruined. We can't really quantify what this means for individuals, but we have about a 52% drop in marijuana arrests in Colorado. So you have a lot fewer people being arrested. We still have inequality of those people who are being arrested. There's still racial disparities, but we have seen an overall drop in all of the surveyed ethnic and racial groups. We have less law enforcement time being wasted as a result. We can see that the number of infractions, misdemeanors, and felonies have all dropped since legalization. The felonies have dropped by the least. There is still an illegal market to serve states outside of Colorado, and they had a very robust medical program that allowed people to grow up to 99 plants until 6 months ago in a house, so there was some concern about diversion from that, including by organized crime. And the felonies, previously, 10% of Colorado people used marijuana. All of it was acquired illegally, so they could have chosen to prosecute a lot more previously as well. But we still have seen somewhat of a drop, and once we have an end of prohibition everywhere, hopefully just like we don't see people illegally selling beer, we won't see continued prosecution and felonies for marijuana. Next up is road safety. This is something that some opponents have seized on and made it sound like we've seen a lot of problems after legalization with road safety. And a lot of what's been said is actually pretty misleading. It's confusing because there was a report in Washington State, and it said that more people who are involved in fatal accidents are testing positive for THC. And so some people might think that means more people are driving and then they're causing crashes and they're high. The problems with this are multiple. One of them is the fact that THC was in a person's system does not mean they were impaired at the time. THC can stay in a person's system for a very long time, so it could be like if somebody drank a beer a week earlier. Next, they didn't do a very good job at data collection before legalization. Naturally, if somebody was arrested, they found marijuana, if they found alcohol in their system, they wouldn't spend the money and time to also search for marijuana because they already had the impaired driving. So they've changed their protocols since legalization. So someone explained this as if you go fishing one day and you use a pole and you catch no fish, and you go back and you use a net and you catch 10 fish. It doesn't mean that there are more fish in the pond. It means you've changed your method. So by the same token, they've changed their method of testing. So we don't really know. Also, there has not nationwide been an increase in the total number of fatal crashes. The Colorado Department of Safety talked about the reasons for increases there. They include people are driving a lot more, the economy's better, there's been a boom in tourism, there are a lot more jobs, a very low unemployment rate. All of that means people are driving more. So the Department of Transportation in Colorado has said the increase, which is also nationwide, was not caused by marijuana. So when we actually step back, there was a study that was recently done where researchers looked at the data on road safety in Colorado and Washington and how many fatalities they had and compared it to similarly situated states. And they said that the change was not statistically different in the road fatalities than in states that hadn't legalized marijuana. Also of note, the total number of DUI citations is dropping in Colorado. So this was from that same report. The total number of DUIs, so not just marijuana, but everything, because if you want a big picture of are more people driving while impaired, then you have to look at everything, including because people are testing for marijuana more now. It's down, not substantially, but by a somewhat significant amount in both Colorado by the State Patrol and the Denver Police Department. And of note, well, some might focus on the increase. There is a total number increase of the total number of marijuana DUIs. Like I said, they are searching for it more. We don't know for sure if it means more people are driving under the influence of marijuana or not, but it's a very tiny percent of the total number of DUIs. Interestingly, cannabis isn't usually associated with risk-taking, where alcohol is. So a person who uses cannabis instead of alcohol might be less likely to get behind the wheel in the first place. Doesn't mean nobody does it, but it's not associated with risk-taking. Next up, there was a lot of concern when marijuana was legalized that young people would start using marijuana all the time. That has not happened. I'm focusing mostly on Colorado data since it's the oldest, but as you can see, it was within the margin of error, but there was a slight drop in the largest survey of Colorado youth, high schoolers using marijuana, from 22% to 19.4%. On our website, we looked at all of the largest studies in all of the legalization states. None of them have seen an overall increase, and most have seen what would be a decrease, but is within the margin of error. So we're not seeing an increase in young people using marijuana. A lot of people focus on young people thinking marijuana is less dangerous, but that's not really the concern that I would say. What's the concern is if young people are actually using marijuana, having them have a realistic picture of marijuana is safe for adults, but it's not something that young people should use, I think is better. So here we have graduation rates. Opponents, including Kevin Sabet, who will be speaking here, claim that graduation dates will go down. Rates would go down after legalization. They haven't. You see in 2012, we had 76.9% graduation rate in Colorado. It's up a little bit to 79%. Dropout rates are down a little bit, so we have not seen the sky fall there. And of course, we have hundreds and millions of dollars in revenue. In Colorado, they've brought in that's the next slide. In Washington, they brought in $400 million in marijuana tax revenue last year alone. That means they do their budgeting by every 2 years. So their 2-year budget from the marijuana revenue included more than $400 million of health funding. That was from Medicaid funding, substance abuse, children's mental health, services for moms and pregnant women, community health centers that could provide medical and dental care. All of that was provided from marijuana funding. And they also had another $211 million left for the general fund to help balance the budget. And then, of course, there's implementation and a few other things. In Colorado, they brought in $247 million in all the marijuana fees and taxes in 2017. That's more than $67 million was earmarked for schools in that state. Each state decides how they want to allocate the money separately. Also in Colorado, last year alone, they had more than $1 billion in legal marijuana sales. So the economic impact of that, the jobs created, the secondary impact is often more than double, according to economists. There are more than 40,000 people that have licenses from the state of Colorado to work directly in the marijuana industry too. And that doesn't count, accountants and other ancillary businesses. So it's created a lot of jobs. Both Colorado and Washington were ranked by US News and World Report as among the fastest growing economies in the last couple of years after legalization. So they're seeing, this doesn't mean it's all caused by marijuana, but it certainly means it has not caused the kind of problems that opponents predicted. And now I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, so we'll take questions. As always, priority goes to students.
Hi, thanks for speaking with us. The title of your talk referred to legalization as something that's about bringing a lucrative market out of the shadows. But you said that for you, the main motivator of your interest in marijuana legalization is the human impact and the social justice element. I'm curious whether you think that the messaging of this issue being something that's too focused on tax revenue or creating jobs is something that might take away from our focus on the human impact and the social justice.
Yeah, I think when talking to people who are undecided, it actually is better to focus on the human aspect. I did title the talk that. The shadows to me refers to all the shadows of the darkness of the legal industry, the environmental pollution, the destruction of people's lives, the violence related to it. But yeah, when I talk to legislators, I almost always, like in this presentation, the money was last. And I think even when we talk about money, it's important to remember that that is something that impacts human lives. If you have more health care, if you have more dental care for people that don't get it. But yeah, it's a good point.
I have a question.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about, you were mentioning over lunch, there's some you work more on the legislative component and working directly with getting legislatures to pass, legalization reform. Could you, I guess, mention some of the states that are at the forefront and some of the challenges you've seen politically for those legislators?
Sure. So of the 9 states where marijuana is legal, 8 of them were through the ballot initiative, and only 1, Vermont, was through the legislature. Legislators tend to be very cautious. They have to worry about primary elections and getting reelected, and a lot of times people that are most enthusiastic about marijuana policy are people that aren't as politically engaged. So passing anything through a legislature is challenging. Only 30 states allow medical marijuana, even though support is in the 80s or 90s. The states that we're most optimistic about for the next couple of years include Illinois. If J.B. Pritzker becomes the next governor, he's made legalization a priority. He's pulling ahead. We're optimistic there. In New Jersey, the new governor, Phil Murphy, who's been in power for about a year, has made marijuana legalization a priority, but he said he'd do it in the first 100 days, and it's almost a year on, and it hasn't happened yet. So even there, last I saw, there were 6 state senators who weren't on board yet, so it's really education person by person by person. New Hampshire is another state that we're working on. There, the governor isn't supportive. In a legislature, if you try to get through, not only do you need the majority of votes, but you also have to get the specific committee chair in both chambers, you have to get the leadership in both chambers, and the governor. So if any one of those individuals is opposed, then the entire bill can die. So in a lot of cases, it takes years and years and years of work, and it takes people really being engaged. As an organization as a whole, one problem we have is funding has been a challenge for the last couple of years, because a lot of people see the polls and they think, oh, this is going to happen on its own. And it really doesn't, as we've seen with medical marijuana. So a lot of marijuana businesses are reluctant to donate. It's kind of a free rider effect, and a lot of philanthropists see, well, why doesn't the industry step in? Why don't they fund the legalization efforts instead, now that there's so much money being made by legal marijuana?
Thank you.
Hi. For a lot of people, the social stigma of marijuana will prevent them from legalizing it. You also mentioned the stigma against for employers. In what ways are you trying to eliminate the stigma, and do you think that will ever happen?
Well, I think there are a couple things. This isn't the reason we work on medical marijuana, but I think that medical marijuana efforts have helped eliminate stigma, because for decades we had this kind of reefer madness, just thinking marijuana is bad, that people would be stoners, that they wouldn't contribute to society. And we've had a lot of realization that for a lot of people it's something they use medically. Interestingly, a poll found that of all the adults that use marijuana, half of them use it solely or partly for medical value, which is way higher than the number of people that are registered medical patients. So part of that kind of shifting to have a more realistic understanding of cannabis in general, and that it's not just something people use for fun, but it's also something that can be medically beneficial, is helpful. My colleague Mason Tvert headed up an organization called SAFER, which the whole focuses on how marijuana is safer than alcohol. And so we've done a number of billboards and TV ads focused on that, because putting it on par with alcohol is something that's so socially accepted, and really having people stop and think, if people are allowed to use alcohol, shouldn't they be allowed to use marijuana? So he's done some kind of edgy things of, I think one was around the NFL, and it said marijuana is safer than alcohol and football with a helmet and a beer bottle. So that's part of it, pressuring the NFL when they punish This was in the context of they had suspended some players for using marijuana, which I think was partly for medical purposes. And so kind of using things like that to spark a conversation of why are we punishing people for using something that's so much safer than the opiates that they otherwise would be using, and so much safer than alcohol, and really safer than football too.
Thank you so much for your talk. Going off of that point, I was wondering if you could speak to sort of the reactions that your organization has faced in response to maybe those advertisements or your efforts when you don't necessarily get the opportunity to do your presentation.
Yeah, so I've worked at MPP, like I said, for 15 years. When I first started working on the issue, a lot of the news coverage was puns. Like, people would just love to make puns about marijuana and thought it was really funny, which on the one hand, I guess, shows that they didn't think marijuana was that serious, because you don't see them making puns and jokes about heroin or crack cocaine. With time, that hasn't happened as much. Now I've had a couple times where I went to speak, and they had a lot of trouble even finding someone to debate us. So we've seen a real evolution where a lot of people thought it was funny and non-serious back 15 years ago, and now are starting to really engage on the issue. Law enforcement continues to be our biggest opponent. There are some wonderful supportive law enforcement individuals and organizations, including one called Law Enforcement Action Partnership that was founded by a former law enforcement officer who's the current executive director, his good friend was killed in a buy-bust for drugs. So there's a lot that see, like, this isn't working. This is destroying officers' lives. It's destroying individuals' lives. But we don't, mostly we see people focusing on the driving and a lot of kind of distortions about some of the data and what's happening in anecdotal reports. So law enforcement once in a while when we worked on decriminalization, we heard that they wanted to keep searching people's cars because they thought they might find something in it. And in Maryland, there was this one case where they had found a body in the back of a car in the trunk after they smelled marijuana. And so they just wanted to not have marijuana decriminalized because they're afraid they couldn't search people. But of course, if you search everybody with a Coke can, eventually you'd find something. The principle of government, the Fourth Amendment, is you can't search for nothing. So we see a lot of very strong opposition from them. And once in a while we get the reefer madness, but we don't get as much of that as before. It's more like we're afraid about driving fatalities or specific legitimate concerns that we can kind of explain.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I've heard that sometimes people are substituting marijuana for opiate use. Is that limited to people who are more medical marijuana patients for recreational use as well? Can you talk a little bit about that and talk about how your organization might be using that to, further your agenda?
Sure. So yeah, that's happening. We've seen a number of studies that have shown that people substitute marijuana and use it in place of opiates for medical purposes usually. I think the data was that there was a 33% drop in the number of people that were using opiates in states where medical marijuana was legal compared to ones that weren't. So there's data showing that it really is happening. In Minnesota, they initially didn't allow intractable pain as a qualifying condition for medical marijuana. And once they did, they surveyed the people. And I want to say it was about 60% of the people who were using medical marijuana had either decreased or eliminated their use of opiates. So we're certainly seeing that. One really interesting thing that I've seen even here in California with people I know is even though we had a very broad medical law and still do, where anyone can qualify for anything, there was still stigma there. People didn't want to talk to their own doctor, didn't think their own doctor was supported. They didn't want to go to the Venice Beach ones that kind of didn't seem very legitimate. And so I know a lot of people that are using cannabis for pain or for insomnia that just didn't feel comfortable doing it before, but once they can go into a store, they can. So I think by the same token, and there is some data showing that we see people substituting legal marijuana, not through the medical program, for opiates. Another concern with federal law is a lot of people feel very strongly about gun rights, and people who are gun owners can be prosecuted federally if they purchase a gun and if they're medical marijuana or any marijuana user. But if it's medical, they have an ID card, and so it's in a database. So with adult use marijuana, there's less concern that you could get caught and you could have to choose between people that are hunters and don't want to have, or concerned about want to own a gun, don't have to choose between the two. But yes, we are definitely seeing that. And we're also, I should mention, when we first worked on medical marijuana about 5 years ago, a lot of states were including chronic pain. And law enforcement would make it sound like, oh, anybody could qualify if you include pain. About a half dozen or so states just omitted it completely. And in the last couple of years, we've been able to go back in all but one of the states that didn't have pain, they've added it. And when we work on medical marijuana in particular, it's a very big point of, you can point to the number of people that have died from opiate overdoses in a given state, and that those people would have been able to have a safer option instead.
Hi, thank you for coming to talk to us. A lot of the human cases you talked about were a product of the fact that the tragedies that occurred were the fact that the people were participating in an illegal activity. So why is this an argument to legalize marijuana? And do you think it's fair to refute that argument by making analogs with other crimes?
So if marijuana were legal, just as we see with alcohol prohibition, we're not seeing people killing each other over the alcohol trade. We're not seeing people getting busted and threatened with going to jail for using alcohol as an adult and having to inform on somebody and then getting killed. So I don't think that somebody deserves to die because they engaged in something that's illegal, that most people don't think should be illegal in the first place. And about half of Americans, including 3 of the last 4 presidents, have tried themselves. So if we can prevent these circumstances where there's kind of this shadowy underground and where people are at risk of theft and death, then we should.
Hi, so it sounds like there are clearly a lot of benefits and barriers to legalizing marijuana, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to some of the drawbacks, maybe not necessarily associated with legalizing in general, but the way it's been implemented. So in Oregon, one of the biggest pushbacks is the fencing laws. They say that it's sort of ruining the landscape. They don't really mind looking at marijuana, but the 8-foot fences, they do. So
Yeah.
Are there other ways where it's been implemented ineffectively, or implementation in the future might look different than where it currently has been?
Yeah, I mean, you always have a trade-off, because on the one hand, you want to make sure people that are growing marijuana are safe, and it's still illegal in so many states, and the illicit market value is so high, and that's why they have the fencing rules. Also in Colorado, all marijuana was grown indoors until very recently, and again, that was done for security, but it means you end up having more energy use, and it causes a lot of inefficiency that isn't ideal for the environment. And it's just a trade-off. And once marijuana is legal in more places and the price goes down and there's not such a big market for illegal marijuana, we'll see less of it. But it always kind of has to be a balance of where are we going to fall between security and potential safety. And there was one case in Oregon of a marijuana grower that was almost murdered by people that broke in. So, there are some legitimate concerns, and it's just a question of, do we want the government to intervene to protect people, or do we want to kind of allow it to be a little more free? I'm trying to think of other ones. The indoor growing is a big one. A lot of this we'll see just change. All of the marijuana laws are intrastate now. They're all set up with intrastate growers. So maybe you have marijuana grown in a desert in Nevada, which maybe isn't the best place environmentally. So eventually we'll see all of that change once federal laws change and states' laws change to allow interstate commerce as well. A lot of people are concerned about the amount of packaging, because they see marijuana as like this wonderful flower that's natural, and then you have all this child-proof packaging. But again, it's just figuring out the balance if we don't want kids getting into it, but is there a way to make that more environmentally friendly too?
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us about this today. My name's Sasha, and I'm a senior here at CMC. I asked this question to the last speaker in the marijuana series, and he didn't really have much to say about it. So I'm genuinely curious with regards to the change in trends of Americans favorably viewing the legalization of marijuana. I think it was 40% in the 1990s, and now it's nearing 60% nowadays. How has this changed policy making in the past, if and how, and will it change policy making in the future, this favorable trend in legalization of marijuana?
Yeah, certainly we wouldn't have any laws if we didn't have majority support, because voters would have voted against it. So it's helping. But like I said, politicians are really behind. So they look, for a Republican running for office, they look at the Republican primary voters. And if they're afraid that the Republican primary voters, they might lose a primary if they vote for it, they might be hesitant. We haven't seen that happen. The more time goes by and the more we're seeing an increase now, according to Gallup poll, support among Republicans is over 50% too. Nationwide support wasn't at 50% until about 5 years ago for everyone. So it's certainly what makes it possible. But I would say you can't assume just because you have popular support that it's going to happen on its own. It creates the opportunity, but it takes a lot of money and organizing and educating the lawmakers. Some of them themselves take a lot of education to get past it, and you have to make changes to address their concerns too.
actually have a question as well. We have an election coming up next Tuesday, and one of the states that you didn't mention as a state that you see as a potential future state for legalization was Michigan, but I understand they have an initiative on the ballot to legalize it. What do you see as the prospects of that initiative on Tuesday?
Yes, so I'm from Michigan, and I was talking about state legislatures, so I should have mentioned Michigan too. It's a ballot initiative, as you mentioned. Both North Dakota and Michigan have a ballot initiative on the ballot on Tuesday. In Michigan, the polls are all well above 50%, so you can't ever take anything for granted. The opposition is pouring about $1 million into ads, many of which are very misleading, claiming that there's no limit on the potency of edibles, which is not true, and otherwise trying to scare people. So it's not 100% a sure thing, but it's looking pretty good. And if anybody is supportive and interested in getting involved, SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which I don't know if you have a chapter here, but somebody might want to start one, is doing phone banking to call up voters in Michigan, North Dakota, which also has legalization on the ballot, and Utah, which has medical marijuana on the ballot. So you can call up and try to get people to polls. And it's kind of an interesting way to just see, like, where do average voters feel about this? How do they feel? What are they concerned about? And federally, too, this election might have a big influence. So Donald Trump has actually said that he would be okay with a bill to allow states to make up their own mind about marijuana without federal interference. The leadership in Congress and the Senate has not been supportive of such a bill. One is introduced and is pending. So if Democrats take control of one or both chambers, there will be a much better chance that we'll have at least that pass. It's far from a sure thing again, though.
We have time for about one more question. See one over there.
Thanks for your talk. I appreciate that this may be a little bit of a can of worms, and I don't actually know what I'm getting into. But I'm curious how MPP works with other groups, particularly NORML, and what the relationship is between different groups like that.
Sure.
On this issue.
Okay, so on the space of making marijuana legal, there's the biggest national groups are our own. Then there's the Drug Policy Alliance, which works on all drugs. They mostly focus on all drugs in all states, but they have a handful of states where they work on legalization of marijuana too. Typically, we just aren't involved in the same states. There's enough work for everybody. There's a couple initiatives where we're leading the Michigan one. They're chipping in money to it. They led the California one. We chipped in money, and we both chipped in expertise to them. So we work well together and just have kind of different spheres to some extent. NORML is a chapter-based organization, and some of the chapters work very closely with us. In Michigan, there's a NORML chapter that's really involved in the initiative too. So there's MI Legalize and us, and we both put in a lot of time and money and resources and work together. We kind of have local coalitions in a lot of the states we work in, and usually NORML's one of the members organizations of it. They don't have, our big thing is changing laws. We have federal lobbyists, we fund a lot of initiative campaigns. NORML so far hasn't done as much of that. They do a lot of kind of education for consumers, they hook people up with attorneys, and they have chapter-based organizations that could be good feet on the ground, but I don't think they've ever kind of hired lobbyists in different state legislatures. So they kind of complement each other and have different roles. And SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, like I said, they're doing calls, and they often we've drawn from them for local organizers in a number of states.
Great. Well, as we mentioned before, this is one of a series in marijuana legalization, so we hope you'll join us on November 15th. It's a Thursday for lunch to hear Kevin Sabet as well. But yeah, please join me in thanking Ms. O'Keefe.
Thank you.